So I saw my sister this weekend and she said, Tess, I watched your video, I loved it, it was so awesome, but what are macros and why do they matter? And I spend so much time in this industry, I live and breathe it, that I sometimes forget that not everybody is in this industry and you all might not be exposed to the same information and lingo that I am on a daily basis. So I wanted to do a video for you about what are macros and why do they matter. Every food is made up of 3 basic macronutrients: proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. Now, there are varying degrees of all of those macros in every food. So, for example, there are some foods that are very, very high in protein and low in fat and carbohydrates. An example of that would be a whey isolate protein powder or egg whites. Examples of foods that are very, very high in carbohydrates only and not proteins and fats would be sugar. An example of a food that is very high in fats and not in carbohydrates or proteins would be oils. So olive oil, canola oil, all those things. Now, those are the 3 extremes, but most foods fall somewhere in the middle where they have a little bit of protein and a lot of carbs and a little bit of fats, or some kind of mix of all 3. So bread has mostly carbohydrates, a couple grams of protein, and like a little bit of fat. Steak is mostly protein with quite a bit of fat and no carbohydrates. Nuts are mostly fat with a little bit of protein and a little bit of carbs. So every food has a different blend of all these macronutrients. Now, the bodybuilding community has understood for quite some time now that every person does better on their own, let's call it macronutrient profile. So some people do better with a diet that's very, very high in carbohydrates. Some people do very, very well on a diet that's high in proteins and fats. Some people do well with a diet that's an even mix of all 3. An example of a diet that is very, very high in carbohydrates and low in fats and protein would be a vegan diet. So people who eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, a lot of grains, a lot of legumes, that is high in carbs, low in protein. An example of a diet that is very, very high in proteins and fats, but very low in carbs would be the ketogenic diet. That's really popular right now. And you see in cultures like Mongolian cultures or Inuit cultures that eat a lot of meat and dairy and cheese and very few vegetables and grains. There are people who do well and thrive on those diets, and there are people who do very, very poorly on those diets as well. So your job is to kind of find what mix of macronutrients is the ideal ratio for you. Now, how do you know if you have found the right macronutrient ratio? Well, your body has ways of telling you, and basically the diet that feels really good for you is probably the right one for you. So you want to look at things like your digestion. Are you having regular bowel movements? Are things getting clogged up in your belly? How is your mood? If your mood is really foul and you're grumpy all the time, maybe not the best diet for you. How is your energy level? How is your sex drive? How are you sleeping? All of those things come together and paint a big picture for how your diet is doing. You have to consider how much you enjoy the diet. If you do a keto diet and you really hate eating all that meat and fat, guess what? It's probably not the right one for you, because the right diet is one that you can sustain for your entire life. Now, another indicator, which is probably part of the reason you're watching these videos, is that the right diet is going to make it easier for you to lose and control your weight. Bodybuilders have known this for years. No 2 bodybuilders have the same diet. And even throughout a prep, they will manipulate their carbohydrates, their proteins, and their fats to kind of stimulate fat loss. And I think there's a big lesson to be learned there, because bodybuilders are basically experts at preserving lean muscle mass and losing fat, which even for a regular non-bodybuilding person is usually what they're looking for. They want to tone up, which is maintaining or growing muscle a little bit and losing body fat. So that's all well and dandy, but how do you know which is the right macronutrient profile for you? Well, the answer is trial and error. There's really no one thing that's gonna pop out. Like, you could do quizzes, you could look at your family health history, but really trial and error is the surest way to figure out which is the right one for you. So I would recommend trying each, three different kinds of ratios. So a diet that's high in protein, a diet that's high in carbs, and a diet that's even for a few weeks each, and tracking how you feel, how you react, what your weight does for those couple of weeks. So through your logging, because you were logging all of your macros for the whole week, right? You should have a good indication already of what your starting macros are. So say, for example, you found out through your logging that you're eating 60% carbohydrates, 20% protein, 20% fats. That would mean that you're like a high carbohydrate eater. From there, maybe you could switch it up and go high protein next. So go like 50% protein and then 30% carbs, 20% fats. Or maybe you want to do an even split. So 30% protein, 30% carbs, 30% fats, 33.3, whatever it is. I would recommend doing a high protein, so 50% or over, high carbohydrate, 50% or over, and then even split 30-30-30 or something close to that for a few weeks each. And those are the three really big basic macro profiles. Once you figure out which one feels best, then you can tweak the numbers even more. So say, okay, I felt really good eating 30-30-30. What if I went to like 40-30-20 or 30-40-20? You know what I mean? So just play with the ratios even more, but staying within that mid-range. So for example, I call it a mixed metabolic type. I do best on an even split of protein, fats, and carbohydrates. But I do better on a little bit more proteins and fats and a little bit less on carbohydrates. Other people would be a mixed metabolic type, but might do better on a little bit higher carbohydrates and a little bit less on proteins and fats. So you can play around with the numbers and see where within that mixed metabolic or where within that high protein or where within the high carbohydrate you fall. So what you would do before you even change your calories, stick to the same calories unless you find that you're like grossly overeating or grossly undereating. Try sticking to the same calories that you were at and just change around the ratios of your food. So now is where you're gonna have to do some planning. You're gonna have to plan your food and make your macros fit. Like most apps have these little calculators where you can say, I want 50% of my diet protein, 30 carbs, 20 fats. And then they'll give you like grams or ratios to target for. So you would put in the foods that you want to eat and then kind of play with the numbers to figure out how to get to that ratio. And as I'm saying that, I'm thinking I'm gonna have to do a tutorial on that because that sounds really complicated. I'll do another video for you guys. Let's say that you've planned your diet, you have all your ratios matched up, all of your food is working into those ratios. Now the tricky part is you have to adhere very, very strictly to that diet to make sure that the results you get are accurate. So if you say, cool, I'm gonna try a high protein diet, but then you actually eat completely off diet and you end up eating high carbohydrate, well then you're never really gonna know if you do well on high protein or not. So the hardest part about this part, I think, is sticking really, really closely, as close as you humanly can, to that diet to accurately assess how it works for you. I would give it a couple of weeks, if not a whole month, on every one of those diets, those ratios, before changing it up. So during that month, you're tracking how you feel, what your energy is like, how your bowel movements are you gaining or losing weight, just all these things. Now, if you are 1 or 2 weeks in and you are just miserable, your body feels like crap, everything's just going to hell, stop. That's probably the wrong diet for you. So if you're doing the math in your head, you're thinking, okay, she wants me to try at least 3 different diets, maybe 4 or 5. She wants me to do this for a couple of weeks or month each. That's gonna sound like about 6 months. And yeah, that's correct. It's gonna take a long time. When you're talking about figuring out your body and learning what feels best for you, what works for you, yeah, it's gonna take a long time. I've been doing this for 10 years. Many people have been doing this for 20, 30, 50 years. guess what? It's still an ongoing process. So you're gonna have to start thinking about this long term. You're not gonna see the magic result in like 1 week and say, oh my God, I figured it out. This is the secret diet for me. No, you've really got to look at it as an investment in your time and in your body and in your health. So realize right now that we're embarking on like a 6-month journey here. And during those 6 months, you're gonna have to adhere very strictly to these macronutrient ratios, but that when you get onto the other side of that, you are gonna have such a better understanding of your body, of what foods work well for your body, of what the right ratio is for you. And then eating just becomes easier. Once you figure out your ideal ratio, you don't really have to track and plan as much, because you know in your head, I'm a mixed metabolic type. I need to eat, even splits of food in a day. So you don't really have to plan. You just say, okay, every meal has to have an even split of these. If you get to the end and say, I'm a carb type, I need to have carbs, then you don't really have to think about it too much. You eat carbs in a day. So yeah, it's a little bit of an investment in time in the very beginning, but it pays off so much in the long run. And that's why people like me can get away with not tracking. I call it intuitive eating, but honestly, it's not that I'm just listening to my body and like doing whatever the heck it tells me to. It's because I've put in the work. I've put in years of work. I know myself very, very well, and I have like a structure and a guideline to my diet that I follow, because I know that that's how my body likes to eat. If you want more information, I would look up a man named Dr. Lane Norton, who is just this brilliant guy. He's one of the leading experts in the field of nutrition and flexible dieting. So I'll link him here. Hope this works and I'm not just pointing at nothing. I hope this clarifies things a little bit. If you still have questions about what the heck are macros and why do they matter, please comment below. Just ask me and I'm happy to message back and forth. And if you need any help figuring out like what the best ratio would be for you to start with, send me a message. We'll talk it out. We'll figure it out together. See you next week.